This documentary will show the research that I have done on representation in horror and the insights I have gained from it. It will highlight moments from horror history, modern horror, and everything in between for an extended view on the intricate subject. This is Horror for Everyone. This documentary is divided in multiple parts, all about misrepresented or too little represented groups of people in horror movies. Before talking about representation in modern horror, I will give some information on the history of every subject. Good representation of people of color has always been a problem in horror, just the same as in film in general. Tropes about black people, like portraying them as monsters, killing them off first, or picking them for stereotypical side character roles, have been haunting the genre for decades. One of the first movies that changed this was 1968's Night of the Living Dead, a movie that cast a black man named Duane Jones as the hero. Director George Romero simply cast Duane because he was the best for the role of Ben, but without knowing it, he created a hero figure in a big film that people of color could identify with.
It's alright.
It was one of the first times a black man had been cast in a leading role without being cast as specifically a black man, not just in horror, but in all genres of film. Night of the Living Dead might be best known for being the predecessor of the modern zombie movie, but casting Duane Jones might have been even more influential. Perhaps Night of the Living Dead is the first film to have a black man playing the lead role regardless of, rather than because of, his race. Jumping forward to the 1970s, we see a rise of blaxploitation. Blaxploitation movies were mostly low-budget and low-quality movies, featuring lots of black actors without getting their representation quite right. A movie that did not turn black people into pimps or hoes was a certain movie from 1972. The movie Blackula, directed by William Crane, had William Marshall playing a black vampire that was bitten by Dracula. Working with an almost all-white crew, Crane got some resentment and resistance while making the movie. But despite the resistance, he went through with it, and it paid off. Blackula gave black people a classic and beloved horror villain, but made him more scary, charming, and familiar. Thanks to its black director, the movie did not become one of many bad blaxploitation movies, and stood out as a good movie that even made a lot of money. Another movie with a black horror villain like Blackula, that came out many years after Romero's masterpiece, and in contrast to Night of the Living Dead did have underlying racial themes and did cast people specifically based on their race, was 1992's Candyman, directed by Bernard Rose. Candyman is a story about a black man with a hook for a hand stalking a white woman in Chicago. But it's a lot more than that, if you just dig a little deeper. The monster in the movie, Tony Todd's Candyman, is to some a personification of Western culture's fear of the black man. But just like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, he's also just a horror movie villain that became an icon of the horror genre. The main difference, however, was that Candyman wasn't white. Virginia Madsen, the lead actress of the movie, confirmed that Candyman was intended to be an African-American Dracula, appealing to the African-American community because they finally had their own Dracula. Even though Candyman immortalized an African-American man as an icon of the genre, it still misses some shots at being a truly good representation of different races. Common tropes about people of color can be identified quickly, and ultimately the movie is still about a white woman being stalked by a black male. These tropes do not return for the 2021 sequel, however, a movie I will talk about later in this documentary.
You met Blade.
While Blade might be more of an action movie than a horror movie, it is still an important movie to mention. Blade was one of the first black superheroes and has become an iconic character soon to be revived in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Mahershala Ali, who has been cast as Blade in the new movie, recently said in an interview that "I don't think I even noticed how, at least at the time, I was accustomed to there not being black superheroes, you just weren't seeing anyone. But once Spawn came out and Blade, then it was really exciting just to have some superheroes that looked like you in that place." The Blade character was instantly, and has stayed, of great importance to both the superhero and the horror genre and the representation of black people. The great Jordan Peele, who absolutely needs to be mentioned in this part of the documentary, is writing and directing black stories to great success, as he is the first African American screenwriter to win an Oscar for a horror film. Even though his work is critiqued by some, it is his way of showing that representation in horror is possible, and with his movies Us and Get Out, he proved that those movies can be a huge success. He shows that it does not matter if a movie has an all-black or all-white cast, and that both can be a success. He just prefers to make movies with black people in the leading roles because there are very few of these in comparison to all-white movies. It really is one of the best, greatest pieces of this story, is feeling like we are in this time. A renaissance has happened and proved the myths about representation in the industry are false. Peele shows us that the race of the cast does not matter, but the quality of the cast and crew do. Black stories can be told without the story being about race. He also shows us the importance of portraying black fears in horror when white fears have been displayed on the screen for so long. Jordan Peele recently co-wrote and co-produced the 2021 sequel to Candyman. The movie, also titled Candyman, has an almost full black cast and in contrast to the original, has a black man in the leading role. Even though Tony Todd's Candyman is seen as the first African-American horror movie villain and an icon of the genre, a lot of elements of the movie itself were in the good representation of African-American people.
Tell everyone.
The switch to a black director instead of Bernard Rose, who co-wrote and directed the first Candyman, must have helped with the positive development of making the 2021 version more representative. The story itself is also more centered around black people and gets across an important message about police brutality, racism, and more. Whether the 2021 Candyman is a better movie than the 1992 version is debatable, but it definitely improves the representation of colored people viewed on screen. Even though a lot of modern horror is starting to get representation right, there are still some movies that fall back on unfortunate tropes. In the 2014 Annabelle movie, the token black character, a black character that is only in the movie to help white people, is played by Alfre Woodard. Woodard basically sacrifices herself for the movie's white people without having any other role in the movie. Despite a movie like Annabelle getting representation wrong, a lot of modern horror is finally getting representation right. Thanks to people like Jordan Peele and Nia DaCosta, and horror movies and shows like His House, Attack the Block, I Am Legend, and Midnight Mass, there is a lot of hope for good representation of all races in horror. The history of representation of people with disabilities is quite complicated. Even though good representation has been present a lot in horror in recent years, it wasn't always like that. On the contrary, it had been the opposite for quite some time. To start this part of the documentary, the 1932 movie Freaks needs to be mentioned. The movie, directed by Todd Browning, follows a young woman who tries to manipulate a person with achondroplasia into marrying her, so she can steal his money afterwards. They travel with a freak show, and the freaks in the movie are played by real people with real disabilities. Even though the disabled people are freaks in the movie, they are not the bad people that they are said to be. The real bad people are the non-freaks, who terrorize and manipulate them. The movie mostly shows the freaks how they really are, people with disabilities moving through life and doing things every other human being also does. This 1932 movie gets the representation of the actors almost right, but this representation didn't stick. The slasher movie era began during the late 70s, and immediately turned the disabled people into horrendous monsters. The 1974 movie The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the early slashers, and also one of the most well known. The movie follows a group of traveling teenagers who end up getting terrorized and killed by a family of cannibals. The most notorious of these cannibals is the son of the family, the infamous Leatherface. Leatherface is a character that is physically and mentally handicapped, wearing the faces of the people he has killed to hide his face. His family abuses him, and makes him kill and torture outsiders to the family. Even though this character is being puppeteered by his family, he is still a disabled character seen and recognized as a monster Leatherface, who performs horrible acts. This kind of bad representation, where the killer is a monster partly or entirely because he is disabled, became a common trope of the genre. While Leatherface might not necessarily be a monster because of his disability, and more because of his manipulative family, another movie franchise that came out a few years later did give the killer an origin story where he became a monster due to his disability.
Kill her, Mommy! Kill her!
Jason Voorhees does not wear his signature hockey mask until the third movie in the franchise, and spoiler, he isn't even the killer in the first movie. Friday the 13th is about a man with severe facial deformities who goes on a killing spree as revenge because the Crystal Lake camp counselors from the first movie killed his mother. Jason himself died many years before the first movie, and it's his mother murdering the campers in his name in the 1980 movie. Jason drowned after being pushed into the lake by other campers that were bullying him because he was deformed, but mostly because he was a mama's boy. Jason did not undergo any other physical transformation after drowning in the lake, and he still had the same facial deformities as before when he started his killing career. This meant that, just like in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the killer was just a human, and that to make his actions fit his physical appearance they gave the character a physical disability. Jason is menacing enough, so giving him facial deformities too was quite unnecessary, and makes the character a monstrously bad representation of people with a physical disability. The physically or mentally disabled antagonist is a common trope in horror. The trope still haunts the genre, mostly in reboots, but there has been some positive development lately. The 2018 movie A Quiet Place and the 2020 sequel have a deaf protagonist. She's not deaf because it's absolutely necessary to the overall story, but because the movie is inclusive and represents deaf people respectfully. The 2016 movie Don't Breathe has a blind antagonist who is not blind to provide cheap scares, but because the story is based on the fact that he is blind. These kinds of characters are essential to making movies more inclusive. Another great representative character that has to be mentioned is Nika from the long-running Chucky franchise. Nika is a disabled character that has been paralyzed from the waist down since her birth. That, however, does not stop her from becoming the hero character in 2 of the Chucky movies and the 2021 TV show. Movies with characters like Nika give us hope for a more inclusive future, with better representation of people with disabilities. Not only is it nice to have inclusive horror media, if done right, it's also a simple and effective way of educating people about mental and physical disabilities. Horror and the LGBTQ have always had quite a complicated relationship. Parallels between being gay and the classic Universal monster movies can easily be found in movies like Frankenstein, where the monster is not allowed to love someone because he is different. This isn't the most literal form of gay representation, but it is a highlight of the struggles that for most come with being gay. But if we fast forward to 2019, we see a movie named It Chapter 2, where a gay couple is introduced in the opening of the movie, beat up, and killed in the first 5 minutes. How can a 1931 movie have gay themes and a basic form of representation, but a 2019 movie be, hopefully unintentionally, so homophobic? Let's have a look at what happened between 1931 and 2019, and delve into the complicated history. After Frankenstein, a lot of LGBTQ representation was censored from movies before they even came out. In fact, Bride of Frankenstein, which came out 4 years after Frankenstein, had the ending edited heavily due to homosexual themes. 1960's Psycho is a movie with a negative theme recurring in many other horror movies, the transgender monster. In Psycho we find out that the character Norman Bates has imitated his mother so much that he often basically becomes her. Of course, Norman Bates is also the feared psycho killer, and the fact that he is both Norman and Norma Bates is an important part of the plot. This makes Norman Bates not necessarily a bad representation, since the character was not really meant to be a representation of transgender people, but more an inventive plot twist. In the 1991 movie Silence of the Lambs, however, the same kind of character returns, but in an offensive way. Buffalo Bill is the male serial killer character of the movie. He kills his female victims and skins them to make a woman's suit out of them that he can wear. Once again, the transgender character is a monster, and in Silence of the Lambs it is not even necessary to the plot of the movie. The character is used to creep people out, and to have his motivation for killing be his longing to be the other sex, a woman, is quite an awkward combination. 1985's A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is similar in themes to Frankenstein and has a lot of homosexual undertones. The movie is about Jesse Walsh, a straight high school student played by Mark Patton, a gay actor who was not completely out at the time of filming. Jesse is stalked by our favorite knife-fingered killer Freddy, who uses Jesse to kill a bunch of seemingly random people. This stalking of Jesse involves going to a leather bar, Freddy making pretty gay comments to Jesse, and Jesse not being able to have sex with his girlfriend because Freddy's tongue appears in his mouth. All homosexual themes in this movie have made people call it the gayest horror movie of all time, and that seems about right. Even though the filmmakers have confirmed that the movie was not meant to be gay, the movie still clearly metaphorizes the struggles of a gay person into horror elements. And though there is no obvious gay character, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 still manages to be a favorite among the gay community, and that's quite an achievement. Another favorite among the gay community is the Chucky franchise. With 7 movies and a TV show, Chucky is quite a big horror franchise and also a beloved one. Both the 2021 series and some of the movies like Seed of Chucky have great representation. You can find the best representation in the series, which has a gay protagonist who has a homosexual relationship with one of the side characters. They do not have stereotypical personalities, and them being gay does not influence their characters or the story. Their relationship in the movie is normal, which it should be. Jumping forward in time to the 2010s and 2020s, we find that the representation of the LGBTQ community has gotten a lot better and a lot more literal than in movies like Frankenstein. Take The Haunting of Bly Manor, for example. Bly Manor is about an au pair who works at the haunted manor and falls more and more into the haunted rabbit hole as the story progresses. Throughout the story, she falls in love with the female gardener of the manor and starts a relationship with a tragic ending. Even though the au pair dies at the end of the story, it's not the same as the famous kill your gays trope, which It Chapter 2 suffers from. In this case, her death has absolutely nothing to do with her being gay, and her being gay isn't even an overly mentioned element like it is in so many other movies or shows. Bly Manor is a horror love story with a tragic ending, like so many other horror movies. The 2020 movie Freaky, that was written and directed by the gay director and horror master Christopher Landon, also showcases a great gay character. The character is gay and proud of it, which is something most gay people in movies lack. Christopher Landon created this character because I'm gay and I wanted to write a character who is not coming out, not struggling with his sexuality. It is important that the tropes that Christopher Landon rejects with this character are rejected more often, and that we rewrite them into great representative characters and inclusive scripts. This way, it is easy to subvert stereotypical characters and even have a simple way of writing and directing more interesting characters and movies. While in the last 3 parts of this documentary I've been going through the developments throughout the years, I will change it up for this part. I'll be looking at the most famous trope in horror, and maybe in cinema in general, since almost everything that has to do with the representation of women in horror starts with her, the final girl. The final girl was given her name by Carol J. Clover in her 1992 book Men, Women and Chainsaws. Laurie Strode from Halloween is a final girl, Sidney Prescott from Scream is a final girl, Nancy Thompson from A Nightmare on Elm Street, Alan Ripley from Alien. That list can continue for a while. But instead of naming all of them, it is far more interesting to look at the elements that they all have in common. The final girl is the girl that survives the horror movie, the final character standing. She is often very smart and not very popular. Being a bookworm or nerd is something that usually causes her to be a virgin, and everyone knows that sex will get you killed in a horror movie.
You can never have sex. Big no-no!
The final girl doesn't go to parties unless convinced, and she definitely does not drink, something that usually gets you killed in horror movies. All these elements add up to an unkillable character, at least until the sequels. The final girl has evolved a lot since her first introduction into the genre. In older movies like Psycho, she only survives a movie because she is saved by, usually, a male character. In more recent years, she is less of a survivor and more of a fighter. In the 2016 movie Hush, the deaf protagonist, played by Kate Siegel, fights off a psychopathic home invader using her own skills and smart thinking. A male character even tries to save her, but ultimately fails to stop the aggressor and dies. The final girl in Hush does not just run away or try to stab or hit her aggressor, but she also plans ahead, makes good quick thinking moves, and is an overall badass female character who ultimately does not need any help. Another character like Hush's protagonist is Grace from the 2019 movie Ready or Not. Grace finds herself in a dangerous situation. Her in-laws are trying to kill her during a game of hide and seek. But she does not just run away from them like so many final girls before her. Grace fights back and, of course, survives the movie. Her character is justifiably scared at moments, but rejects a lot of the final girl elements. For example, she's not as pure as the older final girls, but does run around in a wedding dress, which yields an interesting friction between her personality and role in the movie. Even though she lacks the elements that made characters like Laurie Strode unkillable, she makes up for that lack of stereotypical traits by being a strong female character that shoots, hits and slashes her way out of a horrifying situation. While the prey is almost always female, the hunter is almost always male. This man kills all the final girl's friends and the people who stand in his way of getting to her. All the male characters tend to die quickly, and sometimes off screen. The female characters, however, don't get away that easy. They get killed in ways that highlight the fear in the female's final moments, the blood flooding out of her body, and most importantly, her scream for help. To quote Carol J. Clover, boys die, in short, not because they are boys, but because they make mistakes. Some girls die for the same mistakes. Others, however, and always the main ones, die, plot after plot develops the motive, because they are female. There are, however, movies that break this stereotype and switch the sex of the final girl and the killer. Most of these movies are modern, post-2000 movies, but there are a few exceptions. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 has a male scream queen final girl, but also a male killer. At the end of Friday the 13th, we find out that the killer was Jason Voorhees' mother, and in Scream 2 it surprises us to see a female killer revealed at the end of the movie. These movies tried to switch up a familiar formula, and doing so gave them a big success. It made the movies more original, but most importantly, more surprising and fun to watch. The first 1996 Scream movie was one of the most important reasons why the genre started mixing up the formula and experimenting with the new. Scream showed the audience the common tropes most horror movies suffered from, and made fun of them.
Not in my movie.
This partly bullied the tropes out of the horror movies that came out after the year 2000, but they returned in reboots, remakes, and even in some original movies. Movies that did succeed in changing it up stood out among the others. They were more original and not as predictable as the common slasher movie. 2014's It Follows is a movie that is basically about an STD curse, which, if transferred via sex, makes that person the final girl. Even though we kind of know who the real final girl is, her character is not as pure as the classic ones. This makes the audience wonder if she will actually stay alive the entire movie. There is a lot of contrast between this character and the final girl we know. Grace from Ready or Not and the deaf protagonist from Hush both have elements to their character that make the viewer wonder if they are, in fact, final girls. A lot of horror movies are slashers. That is why the final girl trope is so famous, and the final girl is one of the most well-known female roles in a horror movie. There are, however, the non-slasher horror movies. These horror movies are usually quite unique and don't use a certain formula in their story or characters. These are movies like 2018's Hereditary, with Toni Collette in an absolutely killer role. Even though some people might not see her as the main protagonist in the movie, she's definitely the main attraction. Her performance is arguably one of the best female performances in horror ever. 2019's Us, which was mentioned in the representation of people of color part of the documentary, is also quite far from a slasher, but also has an amazing double performance by Lupita Nyong'o, who plays two very different roles, sometimes even in the same scene. Unique movies like Us and Hereditary, but also modern slashers like Freaky and Malignant, show us that it is okay to switch the gender for roles that seemed gender specific before. It would be great to have more male final girls, or more female killers, or maybe even no final girls at all, or no apparent killers. This development would help to diversify the casting characters of horror and make slasher feel fresher and new. Even though horror has suffered a lot from unfortunate tropes throughout the years, it's on the right track to becoming an all-inclusive genre. Filmmakers like Jordan Peele, Nia DaCosta, Christopher Landon, Mike Flanagan and many others are making movies with good representation for all the groups previously disadvantaged. If we are also able to get rid of these tropes in modern remakes, the future of horror will truly be horror for everyone.